In this video, I'm going to walk through creating or displaying a plume. I'm going to use input files that I've created in other videos. This is the release description file, which didn't really change much of anything except for the latitude and longitude. There's a grid that I created in another video, and met file. It was pretty much the same as the standard charm input, except that I changed the wind direction to the east-northeast and the location so that it falls on the grid. So once I've got the inputs in and I've read in the grid, so there's 3 files that are needed minimum, file itself, the grid, and the met file. So under displays, I'm now going to go Plume, and the default is 15 minutes. So I'm just going to leave it at 15 minutes. And if everything goes okay, you're going to get this little dialog box showing you as time steps through while it's doing the calculation. Now, there is a possibility that you're going to get an error message dialog box instead of this, and that error message may say something to the effect that you need at least 1 meteorological data point inside the grid or 1 release point inside the grid. And you may be confident or sure that you have already put it in the grid. But when you are talking placement in the grid, you also have to keep in mind that the grid is vertical. So if, for instance, you have a wind or a meteorological point, but the wind measurement height is 10 meters above ground, and it's at a point in the grid that's close to the top of the grid anyway, 10 meters, the data may actually be just above the grid, so you will get that kind of complaint that that you're not in the grid. So you have to make sure you keep in mind that it's the altitude at the location of the met or the release, plus the altitude or the height above ground of the met or the release that's used to calculate whether you're inside or outside the grid. So we're almost at 15 minutes. It shows in seconds. And by the way, if this number clicks over ever less than 0.01 seconds, then you most likely have a grid that's way too fine. So you may need to make your grid cells larger so that charm doesn't get bogged down trying to look in too great a detail. And it tries its best, but 0.01 is seconds is pretty much its bottom line that it'll allow. Now, we now have a plume on the screen. This is a snapshot. Snapshot means that it is just an instantaneous view of the concentrations at this very second. So it may be that you, well, let me preface that by saying it's pretty obvious already that you're pretty much saturating the grid. Under options, you can show the grid, so we'll do that. And you can see the releases there, and so this area down here goes all the way well off the grid. And because of that, you probably need a larger grid, but it's partially dependent on what concentrations you're looking at. For instance, this one, I'm looking at 1, 3, and 20 ppm, and it is chlorine, and those are reasonable concentrations to look at. It is a very large release, however. So if you are going beyond that grid, which you obviously look like you are, then yes, you may need more grid cells or larger grid cells. In this case, probably more grid cells. But if you were only interested, for instance, in high concentrations, let's go under options again. You can go to isoplex, and instead of 1, 3, and 20, we'll do 500, 1,000, and 2,000. Just start at 500 and kick it up factor 2. We go to 8, although it says on the screen here the maximum anywhere is 4,000. So now once we've done that, you can see that the plume is entirely inside the grid. So this grid spacing and number of grid cells are perfectly okay. But once again, as I say, if you have low concentrations that you're interested in, you may have to make a larger grid. Or you can make a grid with a grid in it. In other words, this grid could essentially cover the same area as a subgrid that was in the, I went over a little bit on creating subgrids in the video on the grid editor. And on the outside here, you could have another grid that is twice or 4 times coarser, covering the large area to get the really low concentrations and how far out they go. But for right now, I'm just going to leave it as is. Just to give some controls, you can move in and out. You can either zoom in and out by using the menu and changing your scale radius. So instead of 2,000 foot, and that's for this large circle here, and the large circle is what I call a viewport, but you can change that. Instead of 2,000, let's change it to 1,000 feet. And so you can zoom in that way, or of course you cannot see it, but I'll just roll the mouse button or mouse wheel, and it scrolls in and out that way, and these values appear changed. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, this is a snapshot plume, and snapshot is just that. It is what it is at that instant. Quite often what you really need is to know everywhere that plume went and the highest concentration at everywhere that the plume was at. Now to get that, you go under displays. And before I get in there, let me just say, in any of the plan views and most of Charm anywhere, any screen you're on, if there's a menu that says options, that means you're changing stuff on the screen that you're looking at right now. If you go to displays, these will create brand new windows, brand new displays. So what I'm going to ask for is integrated area, and this will show, as I say, everywhere the plume has been up to the calculation time, which is 15 minutes. So you may be able to see the difference. Let me see if I can get them both to 640 feet. And I'll do it this way. Just to have them, you can tile as well, but I think this is, you can see that the plume actually did change because the instantaneous plume does not, at 15 minutes, does not reach all the way out. You can see it just a little touch here where the plume is at, but when you look at everywhere the plume has been, that area is covered too, and in fact it looks like this is also reaching the edge of the grid. There we go. Oh, it's not reaching the edge of the grid. Good. But besides the integrated, I mean, for regulatory purposes, integrated is what you're going to want. If you're looking at things that do have an instantaneous effect, then snapshot is just fine. If you double click on a location, in fact, let me bring up the map that I had created earlier. So right here near the road, this is giving you a concentration versus time at that location. It tells you over here the height above ground and distance from the release site, and travel time if you're just looking at wind speed. At any rate, you can tell from here that it just goes up pretty steady state pretty quickly in about 2 or 3 minutes. You can also view these things like in tables, so that you can get the numerical values, and those will always be in ppm and micrograms per cubic meter. And besides integrated, there are other displays like dose integrated. You have to specify the duration of the dose, toxic load, probability of fatality. If you have population data, you can determine how many people are impacted by each of these concentrations. And if the species being emitted had sufficient information in it for it to explode, explosion overpressure would be available, and you could get a explosion impact screen. One other or a couple other things of interest is one is you can do a vertical cross section. Now in the flat terrain version of CHARM, if you ask for vertical cross section, it just creates a vertical cross section going straight down the center line of the plume. If you ask for a vertical cross section on complex terrain version, you get a slightly different crosshair, but you can, let me start at the source, you can draw a line, and then that will show you the concentration, from the side going down that line, and it starts where you start the drawing. So this is the source is up here. I started it outside where the source was. This gray area is the terrain. If you go back to the snapshot where I drew that line, one of the options is you can show the last vertical cross-section line. So that's the line I was drawn at, and this is the arrowhead goes off to the right of the vertical cross-section. So the arrowhead's over here. And another one of great import is the 3D display. And once again, I'm just working with snapshot. In the complex terrain version, integrated, in fact, all the displays you can do in 3D. In the flat terrain version of CHARM, you can only do 3D display of the snapshot. You cannot do it of the integrated. So now I'll ask for a integrated or the 3D plume, and you can see the plumes coming from the source that I had placed up on the east side of the grid, pretty much. And then you can see it's going through the atmosphere. You can go into the plume and look around, but that can get a little messy. But I'm using the mouse wheel, although you can also use arrow keys. That's what I'm doing now. And if you have a control arrow key, then you can go up and down. Otherwise, it goes in and out. And those are the basics of the showing a plume. Oh, one thing of great import is when you have done the scenario calculation, be sure you go and save the scenario calculation. I'm going to save it as 2. Because then you can come back and you do not have to do all the calculations again from the release out to 15 minutes. If you open the scenario, that file, the SCN file, then you'll automatically go to the end of that calculation. Turn that off. But it saves a lot of time. Some of these scenarios can take quite a long time to do a calculation, especially if chemistry, or more importantly, particles are involved, because particle physics is calculation intensive. And that is it for this video, I believe.